There is no question that President Biden engaged in an elaborate cover-up to hide his mental decline. That's been well documented, including in the new book. Now, the story has taken a strange twist. President Trump ordering an investigation of his predecessor and whether he was really making decisions at the White House. Joe Biden calling the accusation ridiculous and false.
I mean, all of these things that changed so radically, I don't think he had any idea that what was, frankly, I said it during the debate and I say it now, he didn't have much of an idea what was going on. I mean, essentially, whoever used the auto pen was the president.
But the media focuses on Karine Jean-Pierre, the former press secretary who's coming out with a book and who constantly insisted that her boss was running at full speed.
He's the president of the United States. You know, I can't even keep up with him.
80's the new 40. Didn't you hear? He is as sharp as ever, as I have known him to be in my engagement and my experience with him.
And plenty of criticism of KJP. Did I mention she's writing a book saying her White House was broken and she's leaving the Democratic Party?
If she thought that things were so bad or that she was being sent out to the podium to say things that she did not know to be true, then she should have quit, and she didn't.
While Binder's gold digging for book deals, Democrats are rolling their eyes. One Democrat says Binder's book is the most grifty thing I've seen in a long time. And that's saying something in Washington.
I think it's a little crazy to try to play this Biden was persecuted thing. No, he was not persecuted. He flopped at the debate, and he dropped out. Moving right along.
Joining us now to analyze the coverage in New York, Sarah Bedford, investigations editor at the Washington Examiner. And with me, Lucy Caldwell, a board member at Renew Democracy. Sarah, Karine Jean-Pierre just getting hammered by liberals, by Democrats, by journalists for saying, you know, I guess the Biden White House was really broken. And by the way, you can read all about it in my forthcoming book.
Yeah, I think she doesn't have a lot of credibility right now at all because she was such a visible part of perpetuating the cover-up of Joe Biden's decline. But I also think the coverage of her announcement that she's becoming an independent has been, you know, a little bit interesting and shows where the media's priorities are, because you have had former aides emerge from the previous Trump administration, for example, trying to write books, break with the Republican Party, criticize their former boss. And they were welcomed as heroes, as truth tellers. You know, they're really showing their independence. But when KJP does it, the media has no problem dedicating entire long stories to letting former staff members, former colleagues of hers, air their grievances anonymously. Those grievances existed when the Trump folks did the same sort of grift, if you want to call it that, as well. But you didn't have column inches dedicated to their feelings of betrayal.
So what about that, Lucy? She says, I'm no longer a Democrat, and I'm writing this book. She is facing a tremendous backlash, fairly or unfairly. But does that same standard not apply to all the other people who have written books that are sort of tell-alls about their ex-bosses?
Well, it's funny because I think that what is actually happening here is something that I see in my work a lot, which is that we're conflating Karine Jean-Pierre's decision to become a political independent and overlaying that with the idea that independents must all be centrists. And as we know from Elon Musk, a lot of people who are declaring their independence are not centrists. So the fact that she's still a Biden partisan does not mean that she's not a person who truly has broken with the Democratic Party. I think that important messages often come in imperfect vehicles. And in the case of Karine Jean-Pierre, I mean, she is highlighting the fact that we do have a very broken political system. The two parties are very broken. Something like 10% of voters participating in primaries only. 87% of the U.S. House was elected by 7% of Americans because of gerrymandering. So it's an imperfect messenger, but if she is the person who brings attention to this, I'm okay with it.
Well, I would just point out that she has said nothing as all this has come out about the undeniable Biden cover-up, and then suddenly she says the thing about a book. Okay, journalism question. Alex Thompson, who's the co-author of Original Sin with Jake Tapper, revealed the identity of one of his sources. This is a New York publicist named Gilda Squire, on grounds that she lied to him, and therefore the pledge of anonymity no longer mattered. He asked whether KJP, while she was the White House press secretary, was copying her on emails that we use later for the book. She said no. He now produces emails showing it's true, and he also accused the White House of lying. So, what do you take of that? Is that a fair thing for him to do, Sarah?
Well, yes, I think that if if sources don't tell the truth, they're not entitled to the protections of off-the-record agreements. But I think where the criticism has come into play with this Axios reporter Alex Thompson is selectively honoring the agreements when sources have clearly lied, because clearly he and many, many other reporters were lied to by Democratic sources for years. And yet the source that he outed here is someone he's not likely to encounter again. She's not even based in Washington. She's not necessarily involved in politics. So it was sort of a low cost for him to do this. There are other sources who lied to him, who lied to a lot of reporters, who those reporters expect to have to go back to in the future. And you don't see them calling out those individuals for the lies that they were
Lucy's
told.
shaking her head.
So now journalists can't make judgment calls about how they share or don't share sort of what has been said by sources or not. I mean, I'm not exactly an Alex Thompson apologist, but I don't think that that's a valid criticism of Alex at all. It is an interesting episode, that email exchange, and I'm sure Gilda Squire is going to say, well, I was informally advising her. We didn't have a contract. I think the most interesting thing that is reflective of media in this moment and how people who are in positions of political influence, like the White House press office, operate is that now everyone is thinking about their brand, right? We're in this era where a person who is supposed to be a public servant was busy consulting about her Vogue cover.
That train left the station. All right, real quick, start with Sarah. So Donald Trump issues an executive order saying that there should be an investigation whether Joe Biden was actually making decisions or it was his aides using an auto pen. By the way, you don't actually have to even sign it, and Trump has used the auto pen. It's rather unusual, to say the least, to have a president order investigation of his predecessor.
Well, that's true, but under the Biden administration, under Donald Trump's predecessor, he was aggressively investigated by the Biden Justice Department, and reports at the time said that that was exactly what Joe Biden wanted. And I also think the coverage of this executive order has been super unfair. In the executive order, Donald Trump says he wants investigations of things like a coordinated cover-up by aides of whether Joe Biden was cognitively declining. That absolutely happened. And the media coverage has said this is based on conspiracy theories, unsubstantiated claims. Those aren't unsubstantiated.
That hasn't aged well. Lucy, but I think the media coverage of the investigation part has been kind of muted.
Yeah, I think it has been. I think that part of why it's muted is that Democrats do have a Biden optics problem right now, and I think that the sooner that they can get Joe Biden out of the narrative arc, that would be best.
They just don't want to talk about
this. Is
the
right,
46th president.
And every moment that another member of the Biden family comes out and thinks it's a good idea, Ashley Biden writing a big piece, Democrats should make peace with the idea that they appreciate the Bidens, they appreciate all they've done, and it's time to write a new narrative.
Hey everyone, I'm Emily Campagno. Catch me and my co-hosts Harris Faulkner and Kaylee McEnany on Outnumbered every weekday at 12 p.m. Eastern, or set your DVR. Also, don't forget to subscribe to the Fox News YouTube page for daily highlights.